You hear about it all the time, right? Power. It's constantly in the news, which country's got it, which one's losing it. But have you ever stopped to think about what power actually means when we're talking about entire nations? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to break down the real mechanics of global influence. Okay, so let's just jump right in with the big question. When you think of a powerful country, what's the first thing that pops into your head? A huge army? A massive economy? Maybe a giant population? Yeah, those things are for sure part of the equation. But, and this is a big but, they don't even come close to telling the whole story.
That's because the whole concept of power is just so much more subtle and complex than, just counting up tanks and dollars. So we're going to explore some of those hidden dimensions that truly define a nation's influence on the world stage.
All right, so to really get this, we need to start with a solid foundation. At its very core, you can think of power as having two distinct faces. It's not just about the muscle you have to make other people do things, it's also about your ability to do what you want, without anyone getting in your way. So let's lock in a baseline definition here. It's actually pretty simple. Power is a state's ability to influence. And that influence doesn't always have to be this big, forceful thing. Sometimes just the potential that you could do something is more than enough to change how everyone else acts.
And we can actually split that idea into two buckets. On one side, you've got internal power, which is really about autonomy, a country's freedom to run its own show, to make its own decisions. And on the other side, you've got external power. That's the classic idea of making other countries do what you want. And here's the thing, a truly powerful nation, it needs a bit of both.
Okay, so if we can define it, we should be able to just measure it, right? Like with a number? Well, it turns out it's not nearly that simple. Figuring out how powerful a nation really is, it's not a straightforward calculation. It's definitely more of an art than a science.
So let's break down exactly why. First, power is totally contextual. You got to have the right tool for the job, right? What works in one crisis might be completely useless in another. Second, it's incredibly dynamic. Think of it like a seesaw that's always in motion. The global balance is constantly changing. And finally, it's perceptual. Sometimes just the reputation for being powerful can be just as important as the real thing. Let's really drill down on that context point for a second. Think about it. A country with a massive army, loaded with advanced tanks and jets, that's incredibly powerful in a traditional war, for sure. But how useful is that army against, say, a massive cyber attack, or a financial meltdown, or a global pandemic? The answer is not very. The power has to fit the problem. And history is just full of these crazy examples of how dynamic power is. I mean, look what happened after World War II. The old European powers were devastated, and two brand new superpowers shot to the top. A few decades later, Japan and Germany, countries that were defeated in that war, they became economic powerhouses. And then in the 70s, a group of oil-producing nations showed the whole world they could basically bring it to its knees. The big takeaway? Power never, ever stands still. This quote really just nails that whole perceptual element. Having a reputation for being powerful can be an incredible deterrent, right? It can make other countries back down without you having to do a single thing. But here's the catch. That reputation can be incredibly fragile. You see it all the time. Nations kind of coasting on their past glory, only to find out that when they're really put to the test, that power was more of an illusion.
Okay, everybody listen up, because we're about to get to the most crucial concept in this entire breakdown. So far, we've mostly been talking about power as this thing between states, like a tug of war. But there is a much, much deeper level of influence. And it's basically the difference between being a really good player in the game and being the one who actually writes the rules of the game itself.
And this brings us to a really key distinction. On one side, you have relative power. That's what we usually think of when we talk about power. One country versus another, player versus player. But then there's structural power. And that is something else entirely. That's the power to design the entire system, the rules for how money moves, how security works, how trade happens, so that the game is just tilted in your favor from the very start.
Here's the more formal definition. It's all about shaping the frameworks that everyone else has to operate in. Think about it this way. It's not just being good at playing chess. It's being the one who gets to decide how the pawns are allowed to move, or what the queen can do for every single person who plays the game. Now that is the ultimate form of power.
Okay, so how does this whole structural power thing actually work in the real world? I mean, it's not just some big, vague idea. We can actually break it down into 4 very specific structures that basically shape our entire global system.
So let's walk through them. First, you have the knowledge structure. This is about the power to influence ideas and beliefs, maybe through dominant universities or global media. Second is the financial structure. That's about controlling who gets access to credit, kind of like the role the US dollar has in the world economy. Third, there's the security structure. This is about shaping how other countries find safety, like by creating major military alliances. And finally, you've got the production structure, which is all about affecting what gets made and who gets rich, like by setting the rules for international trade. If you can control these four things, you can basically shape the world.
And this is exactly why structural power matters so much. A country's day-to-day military or economic strength, that's kind of like the branches of a tree. They can be hit by storms, they can have good years and bad years, but its structural power, its influence over finance, security, knowledge, and production, that's the deep root system. It's how a nation, like the United States for example, can maintain its influence over the long haul, even when it looks like its relative power is taking a hit.
Okay, so let's start to wrap this up and bring it all together. We started with a pretty simple question. What is power? And we've ended up with a much more sophisticated way to look at how global influence really works.
So what should you really take away from all this? Well, first, power is so much more than just military and economic muscle. Second, remember it has those two faces, the ability to act on your own and the ability to influence others. Third, it's not a science, it's a constantly shifting art form that depends a lot on perception. But if there's one thing to remember, it's this. The deepest, most lasting form of power isn't about winning the game, it's about getting to write the rules.
So I want to leave you with this one final thought. Now that you have this new lens, now that you can see these hidden structures of power in knowledge, finance, security, and production, how does that change the way you see the world? The next time you watch the news, how will it change what you're really looking for?